The episode you are about to hear was originally recorded at an EMSTU, epic marathon stream at Theory Underground. Theory Underground is a lecture course, ongoing research seminar, and book publishing school buy-in for workers with earbuds and professionals who see no future in existing organizations, institutions, and movements. We are all about trying to understand the situation anew. This requires what Marx called the ruthless critique of everything in existence, including the left, Marxism, politics more generally, church, capital, modern schooling. It's all up for question. Whether you are an atheist or devoutly religious, whether you are in a political movement or party, or are independent, whether right or left or neither left nor right, you're welcome here. If you want to get more involved, there's two main ways to do that. To support the public and free content, you can become a patron over at our Patreon. But if you want to get involved, if you want to have special access to some of the course content that is only for members, or if you are interested in being a part of the discussions or being up for the turn, having us actually read your work, then you'll want to become a subscriber. Go to theoryunderground.com and get involved. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Welcome back. We're now joined by Nina Power. How's it going, Nina?
Very well. Thank you, Dave and Nance.
Yeah, great to have you. And I know I kind of already asked you that question off script and the answer was very different, but we'll leave that as a little teaser so that some people will want to go actually chase down the stream version and they'll be dissatisfied with this episode installment. So what we wanted to get into with you, I think today, revolves around the question of the good and the true and the beautiful and the natural and the normal and the ways that these things are or are not related. And just as philosophers, as thinkers who have to work through these things, kind of standing between critical theory on the one side, something that's very good at kind of separating those and showing how a lot of contingency and construction and oppression gets normalized and naturalized, and standing between that tradition and philosophy, which is going to assume that there's a there and try and strive, usually not every philosopher, but a lot of them strive to actually hone in on like an approach to the true, the beautiful, the good, the natural in a way that clarifies how these are different. And we definitely want to get into your approach, your thinkers, your research, and how it might intersect with some of these questions and problems. But as a segue, and it's kind of what the clickbaity title of the stream is right now, we're going to do a little debrief on the Nick Land conversation, which just happened. You were there for the whole thing, right?
Well, not quite all of it, but most of it, probably. Yes.
Most of it. Yeah. So what are your thoughts? I mean, I know you're kind of bringing up some stuff I might have overheard when I was setting up. You were talking to some of the people from the last conversation, but I don't know if you want to go there or somewhere else. But like generally speaking, like your approach. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was at Warwick in the late 90s. I mean, Nick was there for the last year of my first year. So when I was 18, I wasn't taught by Nick, and I didn't really know Nick when I was a student. I was very young. I was hanging around with a lot of people who were older who had worked with Nick. And obviously Sadie Plant and the Sea Crew and various, Mark Fisher and various people who are very interesting. Lots of people were working on the internet to come, basically thinking about the future, like kind of post-human ideas, which are already, being discussed there, cyber utopianism, intelligence, capital, freeing the flows, what that would mean. So a lot of Deleuze and Guattari, lots of people working on Foucault also. Lots of people were really quite out there. Like when I was 18, it was really very exciting and very strange to hang out with lots of people who were like taking a lot of drugs, drinking a lot, like doing proper speculative thought. This was at a point at which university was free. If you were an undergraduate, I was like had a totally free first degree. You got there on merit. It was a different kind of intellectual environment in insofar as it was much more like combative. It was quite antagonistic. It was very free floating, very exciting. And probably Warwick was unusual in that sense, right? Because it had this reputation at that time for being completely wacky. And it was all like tied in with jungle and rave and and this kind of strange moment, which is very much past. And then people were just reading like, insane French theory and trying to think about what was coming down the pipeline. So yeah, that was that moment. So I've known about Nick for a long time, let's put it that way. And I did read his book on Bataille when I was younger. And there was this kind of great split that happened when Nick went to China, and increasingly to people's minds became reactionary or became right wing, either in terms of being a kind of capitalist, like, because the default position was still that you were sort of a leftist and that the French theorists were fundamentally weird Marxists or post-Marxists, but they were still recognizably within that tradition. And the idea, I suppose, was that Nick had taken up the idea of accelerationism and freeing the flows and thought that this was going to happen in China and that this was why he went there. And it was like to see the end of the world or to see this process in action. But I think to go back to some of what he was talking about, it's like this is also a question about intelligence and actually the decoupling of intelligence from the human. And maybe that took a while to understand because it's quite a weird idea. I suppose we're probably more familiar with it now because of AI and the rise of, I don't know, recognizable systems that don't require humanity in the same way. And there's also a deep question about what we mean by intelligence. Is intelligence merely something like pattern recognition? Is it a very specific form of, thing? Is there like, what's the difference between artificial intelligence, general intelligence, and so on and so forth? Can we measure it in useful ways? I think from my point of view, the history of science and the history of the philosophy of science is basically something like the recognition of the capacity of human thought to go beyond itself, such that it becomes inhuman, or that there is an inhuman kernel. Not necessarily, but contingently, and in practice, that has been the case. Insofar as the more we understand about the universe, the more we understand about ourselves, the more detached from any positive notion of ourselves we can have, if you see what I mean. Like, so the decentering of the human from the universe, the decentering of the earth from the solar system, all of these things are, if you like, blows to the idea of our importance and our significance. At the same time, they perversely and paradoxically reinforce it because we are the ones who are capable of this majestic inhuman journey. And that's very strange. So it's something like our nature. Our nature is something like to be capable of exploring and understanding the inhuman or the unnatural, and to become increasingly alienated from any natural idea of who we are. This does not preclude, however, from my point of view, many others, the idea that there is a nature, that there is nature. And I think this question, and not just human nature, by the way, but an understanding of nature in the broader sense as I don't know, as being. I mean, this becomes very complicated whether we talk about being or substance, or the Greeks will talk about physis as an idea of growth and process, the idea of movement. So I mean, if we think about the life cycle of a plant, the way in which something, or like an animal also, things that seem self-moving seem to have a kind of animating principle. Clearly, there's a differentiation we can make at the level of the folk in the everyday between things that are alive, things that live, and things that were never alive. So things that were manufactured, things that were made, and things that have died. And we can't say of something that was artificial in the first place that it dies. So and of course, we might want to be very skeptical or critical of the idea of life, because, for example, is DNA alive? Is the virus I'm currently suffering, is that alive? Like, these are complicated questions. What is life in that sense? But I do want to say something like there is very obviously a natural basis, a basis which is not man-made, is not artificial, is not purely random and chaotic, which would be the other idea, that we are simply atoms in the void, and that there is a sort of fundamental meaninglessness to the universe. We might construct meaning on top of that. But I think it's one of the most fundamental differences in how we think about anything is whether we start from the idea that there is an order, or whether there is chaos, and whether there is a creator, or whether there is not, or at least not one that we can appeal to. And it's very interesting in Plato, I think, that you can have this idea of a fundamental intelligence, which is fundamentally oriented around the question of souls. And one of the major differentiation is in whether something has a soul or not, whether something is animated or not. And yeah, it's hard, I think, not to be a Platonist in some ways. And yeah, and I guess the history of the left in many ways, and remember that Marx wrote his PhD on the atomists, is fundamentally a kind of Aristotelian materialism. And of course, Aristotle is in some ways a Platonist, but that's a complicated question. But let's say, this 100%. Question of materialism, like what, if you begin in Medea res, in the middle of things, like in the universe of things and objects and stuff and being, you don't need to ask the origin question first and foremost. So you simply say, how does matter appear to us? How does history appear to us as a material feature, and so on and so forth. And I think, we have Benjamin Studebaker, you're speaking to later, I think would have a kind of Platonist Marxism, which is kind of complicated, or a Platonist leftism. And I would agree with Benjamin to some extent, although I think I'm a bit more conservative in the sense that I think nature and our nature as sex beings is more significant than the historical idea that we change radically as subjects over time, which would be the kind of more contemporary leftist position.
You're saying that's don't change that. Studebaker's position?
I think, yeah, I think the difference between me and Benjamin, who would otherwise agree on lots of things, is that I'm more conservative insofar as I think that anthropology and the reality of human nature is less changeable, less manipulated by history than I think a lot of the leftist position would assume, right?
I agree 100%.
Fundamentally, that we're fundamentally radically altered as subjects, as historical or social subjects through historical structures and technology. I don't think we are. I think we are basically the same annoying species as we always were.
Woo! That's a big one. And I just said I 100% agree. And so I almost feel the need to sit here and stipulate and clarify why I can say that, but I decided to not do that. And I want to instead focus on what you're getting at. And I know Nance will have some great questions here in a minute, but I kind of want to hone in on still in the aftermath of that conversation with Land. You are much more conservative than either he or Benjamin Studebaker is going to be, in the sense that there is something real about nature, and they're potentially true and good even can be wrapped up in. Obviously, there's horrific things that happen in nature, and there's a sort of indifference to human suffering in nature, and there's like all kinds of terrible parasites that are a part of nature, and then we're a part of nature, and then we do genocide. So I don't know, there's big questions there. And then you can see rape in nature. Like there's all kinds of things where it's just like you can't just take what's natural to be good. But what we're saying, I think, and I want to clarify, is that nature, it's good and bad, and or maybe beyond those terms in some ways, who knows, but there are essences at a certain level. And that there is some kind of an essence to the human, that it's not just a product of its historical moment or its mode of production. And so that would be the response to this sort of this more historicist Plato that Studebaker is going to bring in, and at the same time, it's going to say to land, what matters here is that it's that we're the ones who are thinking, that we're the ones who are doing these things, and as far as like whether a human will make it into the near future isn't going to, like, the defining factor is not going to be the weight of our brains, right? Like, we're humans, we can do something about that. And we're not just, as Mary Harrington would say, meat Legos, right? Am I correct so far, or would you want to?
I mean, just to clarify, I mean, sure, we can see nature as this violent, unfair, unjust thing, and of course it is. I mean, Schopenhauer makes this point, and many others, and it's not to like defend that, right? It's not to say, oh, we can't do anything about, these horrible things, or to accept a kind of inevitability. But I think if we don't accept certain limitations and certain realities, we end up creating more horror. Like, that's the point. I would say that it's the political systems, for example, that suggest that we can radically transform nature that actually end up creating greater horrors, right? So, I don't know how to put it. Like, it's not a defense of the hierarchy and the violence of nature so much as a recognition of it. Is not to say, but and also, I guess, to say that there may not be solutions to every thing, to every problem. And I think this Promethean fantasy that is always a slight projection, oh, we can make artificial wombs, oh, we can do this, right? First of all, I don't think we can, and even if we could, we might not want to. And I get the tension, like with the rocket, like the recent rocket, like people are on the right and in general are very excited, like men in particular, very excited by rockets. It's all good. Like, I'm pro rocket over here, but like people were very, it's all good, and I get it, right? You have Musk, who's like this kind of creative, destructive. We need to get rid of 70% of all workforces, and we just slim it down, and we have these like, these like adventurers, and it's all, I get it. It's thrilling, and this is the sort of techno-scientific Promethean autism intelligence in action, and it looks like this, and it's remarkable, and you think, all right, let's do it, because what's the alternative? Oh, we redistribute everything, and then everyone has like a crappy quality of life, and we all live in mud huts, but at least it's fair, So there's always a permanent tension between the kind of aspirational Promethean overreach and how we spend money on these things, and whether we think it's private or publicly, half public, half private, whatever. It's always been a political question about the space program and stuff. And so we have that aspect. We have that aspect of ourselves. We've solved lots of problems. By solving lots of problems, we have also made ourselves largely irrelevant in many ways. We've made men, especially, particularly irrelevant in general. Like, men have really shot themselves in the foot by solving all these problems to impress women, because now we have all this technology that basically makes women really good in the workplace, because it's all like verbal and non-physical and non-risk taking, and you have the longhouse and the feminization of labor, and women are like, yeah, I'm really good at this, and then but then you have like men who are like, well, what am I supposed to do? Like, I can't have a conversation, and nobody needs my physical strength anymore. I mean, I don't make anything in this country. So like, there's like pluses and minuses. And I think the interesting thing, in all seriousness, I'm being very silly, I apologize, but I think in all seriousness, one of the important questions that was raised in the Nick Land discussion was really what happens to the workforce.
Yeah.
And I think you guys are really good on this. And it was funny because it did look for a moment like he hadn't really considered that question. Like, there was a massive pause where he was like, oh, workers? Like some sort of true aristocrat who just thinks that all things are done, by pixies.
He was like, I've not thought about them for 50 years. Wow. You know,
Yes,
yeah.
it was an incredibly aristocratic English response. Like, you mean to say that things are done by people still?
Yeah.
Anyway.
And well, and that question about surplus value, would it still be capitalism without surplus value? Or could surplus value exist without the human inputs, in terms of the reduction of all your time, energy to labor power, and either the commodification of that or the centralized, you know, command economy that would tell you where to work, right? And it's like he had to really think about it, which is part of why we wanted that conversation to happen, was because when people don't talk to each other, we can get really good at one thing and then kind of miss something that's important. And so we're, you know, that's part of the goal here, is to kind of make those wires cross. As far as, you know, obviously our general approach to that is, we need institutions that care about people, not just turning people into labor power. And that would mean institutions that would care about allowing people, convivial institutions is a way of saying that, right? Convivial tools, you know, using the Illich framework in the way that Andre Gors uses it. I think we're very behind that, and that Studebaker's approach to it is to, you know, he talks about it's time, energy, talent, and tutelage. You can't just have your time and energy freed up, because obviously that doesn't refuse it back together into this useful thing. Like, you actually have to have others, like you have to have parents, you have to have neighbors, you have to have communities. And what people imagine right now is like, oh, well, I'll get replaced by robots and then I'll drink myself to death, or I'll play video games until I off myself. Like, this sounds terrible, right?
Yes. I mean, this is sort of, we had a dry run for this in the lockdown for those people who had middle class laptop jobs, you know. I'm not sure people acquitted, including myself, acquitted ourselves very well in this period, honestly, in terms of our human capacity, or, you know, but yeah, I mean, just I forgot to add one thing about the relationship, because you asked me about the good, the true, and the beautiful, and I do think that the way we understand beauty has to have a relation to the natural, and I think our understanding of beauty is traceable from the natural. It doesn't mean it's limited to it, but I think it can't exist without that. And I think any attempt to, I don't know, I mean, I think artists understood for the longest time that what they were doing when they were making art was, if you like, competing, but competing to lose with God, and that everything done was done really in the name of to the greater glory of God. Whether it's, you know, Bach or Michelangelo or any of these sculptures, and that something like talent was a God-given gift, and that genius was really being able to kind of translate that talent and speak on behalf of people, everyone. You know, that there is a kind of universalism of that, and that you owe it to other people, if you like, to share your talent and to express it. But it's not yours, like you didn't make it, like however hard you work, right? Like you were given it.
Right.
And I think when we think about beauty, it's like, you know, my favorite image, one of my favorite images ever is very, very famous image, is Dürer's Melancholia 1, where you have the angel who is possibly humanity, surrounded by all of the tools and implements and geometrical shapes and numbers and all of the great inventions of semiotics and structure and techne, looking simultaneously naughty and depressed in the face of a sunset. um, and I think it's really, for me, this image is like this recognition that whatever we do, however brilliant we become, however fantastic our measurement systems and our tools and our implements and our art is, it will never compete with a sunset. It will you know, there is nothing we can make that will compete with God, and that this realization is actually paradoxically a positive one. That because we shouldn't be trying to compete. Like, you know, I can't make anything as beautiful as this fern, right? And this fern was like £2 from my corner shop or whatever. It's like, and that's okay, like to be humbled in that way. You know, when I look at the birds on my balcony, you know, they're infinitely beautiful. And, you know, what can I do? I can write a poem. Like, great. So in that sense, I think there is this relationship between the natural and the beautiful, or the created and the beautiful, the non-human created, like we could say. Like, there's lots of different ways of defining nature, but we could say it's something that we did not make. We might be able to intervene in it, we might be able to destroy it, but it doesn't come from us, right? Like, we did not make nature. We may partake in nature depending on where you locate it in us, or whether we're some sort of alien life force that's been put here to destroy everything. Open question.
Excellent. I think that does a lot to sort of set up this approach. And before turning it over to Nance, I just want to say, on this note, you were memeing at the time, but obviously there's a kernel of truth to it. This idea that, well, guys just want to feel useful. And on that note, David Graeber does talk about that in his Bullshit Jobs, and the essay he wrote before that, I think on the same topic in that book you were the editor of, or whatever. But that, in that piece, he says something about that, like that there's this thing where it's like, it seems like guys would rather feel useful than actually be useful. That a lot of what we see as a reaction against any other way of living is coming from this sort of anxiety about, like, well, I want to feel like I'm useful, and I'm over here, I'm just like, I want to actually be useful. Like, I don't want to feel useful. I want to actually be useful, and then have the feelings be true, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of said that you.
Yeah.
What's that?
Go on.
Well, you had said that you were joking, and I'm just saying that that there's a thing. There is something there, though. You know.
Oh yeah. For sure. And I mean, I think this complicated thing about, like, well, what happens when we've created a world that's like actually quite comfortable and works, and then there isn't actually this much need for like risk taking and stuff, you know. And I was just discussing Beau is Afraid, the Ari Aster film. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but you know, it's really, I would, one way of reading it would be as like a disquisition or a meditation on the longhouse, and what happens in a world that is completely feminized and completely based around safety. In reality, it's actually a very dangerous world, because like, it allows for all kinds of things to take place that are not controllable, and if it has a kind of liberal mindset. Like, there's a 20-minute depiction of the contemporary city, which you can't tell is whether it's a kind of paranoid delirium or like a really happening to the character, and it's like the most reactionary depiction of a contemporary city you've ever seen. Like, if you took it at face value, you'd be like, this is a devastating critique of the current city, like Portland or like San Francisco, whatever. It's a really interesting film, and it partly raises this question of a highly technologically protected world that values safety and feminine values over adventure, risk, and typically male talents. So I was going to ask you, like, whether feeling useful is like a desire to, is feeling being used as synonymous with like desire, like wanting to be useful, like, because, or do you mean like a kind of I don't know how to put it, like a like mirage or a delusion of being useful? Like, you're saying men want to feel useful.
Yeah.
But you're making a distinction between like feeling useful and like being useful. So I don't know. Go on.
I think it's like a belief, because like I think we are, like, we just kind of find ourselves in the modern world that we can't make sense of, and there's pain and horrible things going on, but there's also, you know, moments of joy and maybe even some sublimity. But we're confused and we're lost, and we just, I don't know, like, we're like, so what? So it's we want to believe that there's some purpose to us being here, putting up with all the things we put up with, and not be like, oh, it's so hard to be a man today. But no, I mean, I have sons, and like I'm afraid because I want to teach them, like, hey, be masculine, be a man, stand on your business. But where's the line? Like, it's not about being a toxic masculine person, but there's a type of masculinity that is nurturing and that is constructive and goes out into the world and accomplishes things and supports people. And it's a really fine line that's hard to find today. And it really is about feeling utterly useless and meaningless.
Yeah, and I wonder if there is, I mean, I sound very essentializing, but I mean, some of the stuff I've read around masculinity and aloneness in the universe, I did this like long essay on depressive suicidal black metal, which is this particular subgenre, and I'm sure you're familiar with, but it's very, very male, and it's about this sort of feeling of alienation, not only from in the classical Marxist sense, but like feeling alienated from the cosmos itself and from nature itself, actually. And that the one of the ways in which masculinity presents itself to itself is in disharmony with nature. And I think there's still a way in which women, like however alienated they might be, there's no way of putting this that doesn't sound like horribly essentialist, but I don't quite necessarily experience that level of alienation that some men are capable of at the cosmic level. And I think the loss of purpose really only goes to confirm that. And I'm generalizing, but I think, yeah,
So can we clarify what is it that we can't, that the guys are not able to do here, that's driving this?
I would say that there's more an active drive to intervene and to act in the world in such a way that sets up potentially an opposition between the world, or the thing upon which one is acting. And if the world itself doesn't allow that, then there is a feeling of alienation which is really quite massive. A feeling of being like rejected by the entire universe, as some men have described, and I think this genre in particular, musical genre, really reflects, is this kind of cosmic alienation. And I tried to sort of write about that. And we know that women are like typically like a bit more sociable, like they generally make social links, social ties, and a bit easier than men. And I when we think about kind of loneliness, we're often talking about single men, and we know that like men, if their wife dies, if they were married, they don't do as well as women, like on their own in later life and that kind of thing.
Yeah, we need our homies, and we need our love, and we need to be able to obsess over things and basically go off into the clouds, but we could lose track of reality and not get brought back down to earth. It's very easy to not be brought back down to earth. Like for me, like the relationship I am in is grounding, and it's like that is such a powerful metaphor, and it's like the nurture that comes from it, and just from human touch, it really is grounding. And I'll feel like where was I? Like literally, what? I just feel like I was off in some other universe for a while, and then I'm brought back down to earth. And I think there's maybe more constructive and less constructive ways to obsess, maybe more constructive and less constructive ways to leave Earth, and better ways to return than others. That I can think of all kinds of examples for that, but I think it is if not always a male thing, it is definitely like a super masculine thing, right? What we're getting at, yeah.
No, for sure. I mean, maybe this isn't like the most interesting way of approaching it, but I think, yeah, I mean, maybe this question of purpose, it's like in the current context, what avenues are there for this to achieve meaning in this way, right? Like, and this is a question for all of us.
Mhm.
But in some historical moments, it's easier for some groups than others to achieve it, right? And to be recognized and to be rewarded. And I always like, there was this great Matt Christman definition of what it meant to be a man, and this is like, coming from a leftist perspective, and he was saying he felt like it was this abstract rage to protect. And I thought that was very beautiful because it combined this sort of the caring dimension with a really like kind of fearful and potentially violent aspect, right? So he would say like, oh, every time I go into a room, I like size up the room, and like he's saying that all men kind of do this a little bit, like that you look at other men and you're like, could I have him in a fight? And it's not that you want to like be violent or anything like that, but it's like the precondition for social life to unfold is of course it's always the latent possibility of violence, right? Societies are based on the repression of civilizations, based on the repression of violence, or the occlusion of finding violence, and so on and so forth. And for the Greeks, like what it meant to be like a good man or to be virtuous was to know when to deploy violence in a way. Like that was one of the aspects. It was a question of judgment. So the most violent man was like lacked judgment because he was simply being, insane. And of course, like those men are generally in prison. Like the most alpha men, the most violent men are in prison. Like they're apex models of masculinity, but they're not like particularly functioning ones.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, when we're talking about apexes. I said
Don't use violent language, Dave.
I'm sorry. You're right.
It's a microaggression
Trigger warning.
or something.
Trigger warning. Yeah. No, I love cats and I don't like to skin them, but there's a lot of ways to be masculine, and we're not talking about courageous and strong and making hard decisions, though of course I think that's all included. But no, we're specifically talking about obsession, and of course we can get all Lacanian and just say that the sexuation in this Lacanian sense, right? The obsessive neurotic is almost always a male, whereas the not that, which would be the hysteric, that's going to be almost always the female. And of course there can be exceptions, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I don't know if I care too much about doing it within that framework. I just have to put my cards on the table. It's why I keep using the word obsession, though, of course, a better word perhaps might be devotion, right? And that devotion to a cause, devotion to a person or a set of people, devotion is a kind of love, and it's not just pure drive for its own sake, which is why I do like that language a little bit more than obsession.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
no, totally. I mean, it's really the quality of the devotion and the object of the devotion, right? Like, if one devotes oneself to one's community and is acts in such a way as to think about the needs and desires of the community insofar as it's possible, and to act in accordance with them. That's clearly a lot better than being devoted to watching 10 hours of pornography a day or whatever. Like, there are better obsessions or devotions than others. So let's be clear. And I think if we eliminate the distinction or any judgment between one desire and another, like we're in trouble. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that brings us back to the idea that anomie is not just the loss of some shared sense of what's right and wrong and true and good. For Durkheim, anomie is desire coming unchained. Like it's actually it is Deleuze. It's Deleuze and Guattari. It's Marcuse and Reich. It's the New Left. But it's really just it's capital flows doing their thing for its own sake, and this complete lack of regulation over desire, as well as this completely absent conversation about or this conversation that is missing, a conversation about there are better ways to live, and really upholding examples or exemplar sort of models of ways of living. That's what Durkheim was worried about, but it's also like, just, I've been thinking about that a lot lately, because I really only started reading Durkheim seriously in the last year. And his critique of socialism is that it thinks that the role of the state should be to run the economy, full stop. So no regulation over consumption. And then he thought that communism at the time was, instead of worrying about production, which would be more private, I guess, from the kind of communism he's focused on, it would be more private production. The role of the state becomes the regulation of consumption only. And so it's like, on the one side, you have no regulation over consumption. The other side, you have only regulating consumption, but not production. And Durkheim's like, nah, both of those are bad. Both of those are not going to work. And I think that, even though it's like he's saying that all before like any real engagement with what Marxism becomes later. So it's kind of hard to bring that into serious dialogue without doing some extra heavy lifting. I'll just say at the base level, though, I think his point is, yeah, the unshackling of desire is a form of slavery. It's a form of misery. It creates nothing but harm. And what it sounds like we're all in agreement with here is, you can't flatten desire and drive. Like there are kinds of devotion and there are kinds of devoted objects, and that this is something that has to be worked through.
Yeah, and I don't think liberalism has the kind of guardrails, like the harm principle doesn't do enough to really address that deep question of what desire is. Like, if you say that desire is fundamentally good and should be unshackled, like, and then you say, but the harm principle, like, that's going to prevent overlap or problems, like, it doesn't. Like, I mean, not the least of which, I suppose, is because I don't know how to put this, like, the erosion of previously existing social norms through repeated desire-based practices erodes the conditions of possibility for making any kind of judgment whatsoever, right? Which would then be back to the idea that the state's only role is to regulate consumption or whatever. Like, it's, and of course we would be very wary of a state that dictated moral terms, but we do have, like, the law, right? The law is not being very well applied at this point. It's really rather asymmetrically applied all over the place, whether it's to do with whether you're wealthy or, what your identity is. I mean, we're having all kinds of issues with this. In the UK, it's very, very obvious that there is, like, multiple two-tier systems going on. But the law isn't sufficient either, right? Because the law is like an abstracted translation of moral principles, perhaps, but it's not grounded on any kind of social ontology, really, or any kind of anthropology. It's simply like, here are the laws, and if you don't know them, they still exist, and that's what it is. And we can use them whenever we like as the state, or not. So, yeah, I mean, there is this huge vacuum that is to do with value and the good. And that, in the book on men, I tried to talk about this idea of, like, well, what it might mean to be a good man or a good woman. And that's not to fulfill a particular telos, right? To say, oh, if one is to be a good man, it is to fulfill these criteria. And that would be, make that concept full. It would be to say, to have the possibility of the question of good as part of one's sex, that is already, like, a great advance. Like, we've forgotten that there is this question or this link between one's sex and goodness. And there may well be slight differences in how that is played out for men and for women.
So there's several different directions we can go in. And what I kind of want to get into this movie recommendation that's coming up in the chat, but let's see if there's time for it, folks. There's several great things in the chat. Thanks everybody for bringing them all up. The one I want to at least touch on is Jay Steegs, Jordan said, I'd like my desire to be bounded to meaningful things, not just floating around. And MA 512 said, but do you want to self-bind to meaningful things or have it bound by others / outside forces? And the reason I really like that question is because it actually brings us into dialogue with Todd McGowan's piece in Underground Theory about the German idealist definition of freedom as self-limiting. But of course, the issue there is there's a big difference between people representing the society doing self-limiting, which is to say, deciding for everybody the kinds of limitations that will be imposed, and then the individuals within that society saying, yes, I will self-bind myself to this law or moral principle that has been put on me, versus us in our liberalism, or I'll just say in our liberalism, coming to our own sort of individualist conclusions about what we want to bind ourselves to. And then he said, in response to MA 512, a bit of both. I want my obligations to my own desire to be partially mediated by others. And I guess I mean, saying a bit of both is definitely like the easy answer. And like from my own standpoint, I'll just be transparent. Yeah, I was able to quit drinking. I was able to quit drinking without any social support. And in fact, I was able to quit drinking despite the fact that the entire society is pushing me in the other way, right? Because I didn't have like the social support of, say, a church that would help me with that. And I didn't do AA. So it's just like, no, I was able to do that on my own. I haven't drank since 2016. And I know you also quit, I think, right? Drinking. And we have a lot of people, here in various forms of recovery, right? But then I'll just say, like, it's easy for me to say that. It's a lot harder for me to say that I've quit other things that I don't like, that I end up doing. And in some cases, I feel like, no, there should actually be state, like hardcore regulations put on some of these things that I'm pretty angry about not being able to separate myself from entirely. Nance, you getting excited? Yeah. Go off, King.
So the other day I saw something on Reddit, because that Reddit's one of my bad habits. I don't have like proper social media. I just barely got on Substack and I'm on Reddit, but I saw someone complaining about kids these days. And I didn't respond because it's often not worth responding on Reddit. Like, the only worthwhile thing to do on Reddit is scroll and downvote, and that's just about it. It's almost never worth responding. But they were complaining about kids these days, and they were like, oh yeah, kids have access, to this and that and this and that. And these are true. These are problems, and we should like collectively find a way to kind of solve what kids have access to. But it bothers the shit out of me when people talk about like structural solutions, because there are individual solutions in these cases that can make a difference. And so me being happy leftist over here, I'm more often going to bring it back to structural, like when people start talking about problems. But in this case, parenting, I think, is this kind of individual thing, telling your kids what to do, what not to do, having conversations with them, being open and like just fucking parent. Like, don't just hand them to the device. Talk to them about the device. Be involved in their usage of the device. Set a role model, like be a role model for them to follow. Like, that's one thing. Like, I have to not be on my device if I want to tell them, like, hey, you need to kind of cool it. But it just bothers me when people want to talk about restrictions and like unfettered access and this and that. Because yes, that's true. But also, like, take that shit away from your kids. Smack them. Yell at them. Cuss at them. Like, parent, dude.
quick little interjection here. This was recorded before Nina Power was on the 2025 plan for Weaving the Braid. What we're doing here is weaving her course, Philosophy of Nature, with Benjamin Studebaker's course, Intro to Political Theory through 12 Thinkers of Political Theory. My course, Core Concepts and Fundamental Problems at Theory Underground, and Michael Downs' Fault Line Theory between Deleuze and Lacan, between Žižek and Land. It's going to be a lot of fun. And these courses are all kicking off in January of 2025, but the recordings are available after the fact, and so you can always join late and binge to catch up. But you can access all 4 of these courses, as well as the ongoing research seminars that I do, that Benjamin does, that Mikey does, here at Theory Underground, by becoming a subscriber. And by becoming a subscriber, you help free Mikey. So it's a win-win, guys. Let's go.
No, sure. And I think the parenting thing, I'm not a parent, so, I'm literally not qualified to talk on this, but I think this idea of the good enough parent, like, people get hung up on like being the perfect parent and and then it becomes this middle class competition and status about and that's really bad. And that's just using your kids as some sort of thing. And I think, as long as you like love and are interested in your child, it's like, what's your child's imagination? Like, whenever I speak to children, I really like it because I don't have to do it all the time. And I'm the person who gets to come along and be like, tell me a story, like, and then spend like an hour with the child, or the parents are like, oh, like she wouldn't have a bath or whatever. And I'm like, oh yeah, I get to have a fun magic story time. And it's it's kind of different. But yeah, I mean, I don't think we should be handing over things to the state. I agree with this completely. I think it would be good if like the laws coincide with people's like what is good morally for people, but it doesn't. And in that sense, like the family is this kind of site of resistance often against the state. And like somebody like Christopher Lasch on the left would make this point also, that it when the state wants to intervene in families, it's usually really not a good idea. It's usually to take your kids away to put them in the army, or like, you know what I mean? So I think there is absolutely this defense of the private and even the subversive dimension of the family, like it can oppose when the state is going wrong. That said, like these questions of desire and tool use and technology and drugs, like really, really complicated. Alcohol is a really good one because the vast majority of people can drink normally. And I, for one, certainly wouldn't want to ban it, right? Like insofar as people enjoy it, like, I'm married to someone who can drink like a normal person and who drinks around me. Most of my friends drink. Some of them don't for whatever reason, not necessarily because they're alcoholic, but that, they don't like it or whatever. But, I would not want there to be, because like me and some other people have a problem, I don't want the state to be like, no, nobody can drink, like that wouldn't be appropriate historically, culturally, especially not in Britain. The pubs are already under siege. We have a very like puritanical weird moment at the moment with like Keir Starmer, Labour Prime Minister, is like trying to ban smoking in pub gardens, which are like outside, and all of these sort of like petty micro like control things that are also like taking away people's enjoyment. Like it's really bad. And there's like proposals like, oh, we should stop people from making jokes in pubs in case they offend a hypothetical third party. Like all of this
Oh my
mad
God.
No, it's really bad. It's like the offended ghost. Like
Keir
this is the new
Starmer's doing that?
yeah. I mean, this
Ooh.
guy is like he's a prosecutor. He's a very evil man and very boring and evil. Like this is the nature of like contemporary governance, is like petty, boring evil. It's not even like, like grotesque, grandiose, dynamic, sovereign villain evil. It's like, you can't have a cigarette with your beer in the garden.
Oh my God. Like, could we have Stalin just because he's more fun? Like, at least interesting, right? Like, geez. Wow.
No jokes, comrades.
So I guess so Nance, I feel like you're either taking up the position of the adamant, 14-year-old in the room, or there's a position that you could stipulate into a much stronger one. And I'm just being uncharitable, perhaps. And so I want to give you your opportunity here. But, okay, so alcohol. Yeah, I'm not saying that alcohol should be so well regulated that I couldn't have even started drinking in the first place, because I think Nina's right. Most people can be perfectly fine. Mikey's a good example of someone who doesn't like to be drunk, right? Like he'll have a beer while he's doing a lecture at Theory Underground. You've never seen him tipsy on a TU stream, right? And I've never seen him tipsy, period. Well, yeah, that's not how it is with me. It's not how it's going to work. Okay, but I'm not talking. Okay, when I brought in regulation, and of course, my position would have been a really absurd one if I was talking about drinking. But I'll just use the one that comes to mind easiest as a male. It's pornography. All right, and I did not choose to like the kind of porn that I chose, or that I latched onto as a fucking 12-year-old. So that's what bothers me, is that 12-year-olds, you're going to say, well, the father should yell at the kid and say, don't do that. Well, yeah, he did. That didn't really change a goddamn thing. Children should not be able to get their hands on this stuff. I'm not saying that adults shouldn't, but the fact is we live in a situation where children have been able to get their hands on it very, very easily. You know how easy it was for me to get alcohol? Not that easy. We had to pick up homeless hitchhikers and then pay them money to go get us the alcohol. That's how we did it, or we stole it. It was hard, we couldn't just do it whenever we wanted to, and that made it so that we only did it sometimes. Pornography was always very readily accessible. And now they've made it so that, for instance, let's just say Pornhub, if you're in the right state, they're going to say you actually have to sign up, and you're going to have to use a credit card and your driver's license to even have an account. But of course, you can use a VPN to skirt that anytime you want, and any kid can figure that out as well. And then anybody who wants to be so libertarian that they say that they don't care about this issue, or that those kids should be able to decide, I consider you to be a real groomer, first of all. And second of all, no, I just don't think that kids know what they want. They do need to be guided, and to some extent, they need to be guided around stuff that is that potent that it's going to make girls hate being women, or never want to become women, and it will make boys never want to be men, and it will make boys get stunted in their development and spend the rest of their lives having a troubled relation to their sexuality beyond what it would have been if it was just Catholicism in the 14th century. So there we go. What do you want to say to that, Nance?
No, it is the case that, like, going back to the family, like the destruction of the family in service of this. I don't even know what they like claim it's all about. Like, oh, let's destroy the nuclear family. I don't know what that's about, but it is true that it has been just destroyed. Like, parents don't have time to parent. You can't afford to be a parent. That's true. That's a huge problem. That takes away parents' ability to filter this shit for their kids. But then also, like, materially, yes, we do live in this vast, weird, fucked up world where there is just unfettered access to all this fucked up shit. So I think my position is like, rather than despair, I want to like turn back in and be like, well, what can I do? What can I do? I think that's why I had that reaction to that. Okay. But yeah, it's a huge material problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, I don't know if
that helps.
Want my thoughts on this, but
no, Nina, I want your thoughts as a person who I think has thought about this more than most women in our lives, especially as a female who does not necessarily have the direct experience of all this, but who went and did the actual sort of sociological research to try to get the pulse for like what guys actually want. You know what I mean? Like you wrote a book about that. So it's like, I definitely want to hear your thoughts on that. And then I also know that you're familiar with Louis Louis Perry's works on the case against the sexual revolution, which I think probably factors in here. And maybe it'd be a good chance for you to sort of say whether you're just kind of all on board with her project or if you'd separate yourself from that to some extent, because I know you can kind of get lumped up with her. And so, yeah, I'm just super curious to know about how you do approach these problems and questions.
Yeah, sure. I am very sympathetic to a lot of what Louise says. I think her methodology and her approach is not one I would take, which is largely through like evolutionary psychology, and she's writing for a particular audience, I guess, who would maybe understand things more in that term, but I don't think like that. I think much more poetically and aesthetically and philosophically. We might come to some similar conclusions. I mean, I think Louise's audience, who she's actually appealed to very successfully, I have to say, she's like extremely successful as a writer, and as a figure, is to say to young people in particular, you don't need to go down this path, right? That this model of the self as this desiring subject in which you find your identity through sexual exploration and pornography is only one option, and there are others. And she's not even making a religious point, actually, to be honest. She's simply saying, look, it's more in your interest as a young man and a young woman to not do that, and to have meaningful relationships that are not eroded by this stuff, and to maybe think about getting married if you want to have children a bit younger. And it's eminently practical. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, I was definitely brought up in a hyper liberal culture. The 90s was also very hedonistic, and I think a lot of us had sex for way too young. Like, I don't think anyone is like, yes, it was really good that we had sex young, like I think most people would be like, I don't really understand why we did that. Like, it was just a sort of weird expectation of the culture. It wasn't like someone was saying you must be sexually liberated, but in a way, kind of were. Like, bizarrely, like I read my teenage diaries, which I still have, and it's so bizarre to me. But in the 90s, like, the worst thing you could say about another young woman was that she was frigid, and there's all this critique of other women in my diary, like, and I'm thinking, like, what? Like, why was this like? I was saying, oh, Becky's really nice, but she's frigid. I was like, why am I saying that? Like, why is that a critique of another woman? Like, what do I care? That, like, it's so strange. But it's so, we obviously swim in a culture, we can't see the water in which we swim in, right? Especially if this is the only water we know. And then everyone's like, yeah, we have to get drunk and take drugs and have sex, and that's what you do to become an adult or something. And we were all on board with that. But yeah, it was completely meaningless and pointless. Like, I don't think it was good that we did that. I certainly don't think that I found myself in hedonism. It's certainly, they got way out of hand later on with the drinking, which just became hellish and nightmarish and like blackout drunk, just absolutely not enjoying anything because I wasn't even there. So like, what was there to enjoy? Like, nobody and nothing. And it was just, chaos and hell and madness, and also horrible for other people. Really bad, and so it's better that for everyone that we don't do these things and everybody is in relation. And I think once you understand that there isn't unilateral desire, especially when it goes wrong, and that actually you're putting yourself and other people in harm's way, you do have a much more coherent sense of like a set of relations, and like, it's not good to be like implicitly relying on other people to get you home, or implicitly relying on hospitals to look after you if you're sick. It's like, you also have a duty and like responsibility to look after yourself, or at least that's possible. You can't rely on other people or the state to do all that for us. And I think that was a great revelation. Maybe it's really obvious. I should have learned that, understood that much earlier on. But yeah, so just on the porn question, yes, intuitively, and my objection is first and foremost aesthetic and to do with the imagination. I think porn is very powerful. Clearly, it has an immense imagistic effect on us. We recall and we remember pornographic images very, very intensely, and they do shape our desire. And I think, Dave, you made this point about almost like, I discovered what it was I like, and people get latched onto a thing. That can often escalate, and we understand that, like, obviously this can go in very bad directions as well, especially if people are seeking out like harder and harder stuff, in the same way that it works for any addiction, like moving from beer to spirits, or from I don't know, like weed to heroin. And I'm not making that kind of stupid slippery slope gateway thing, but I think there is a dimension to it, you know, which that's true, right? You need something stronger to get you going, you know, like the alcoholic who starts you know, sipping vodka in the morning just to get back in the game, you know, because you're so hungover or whatever. Like, it gets harder. And so it gets harder. But yeah, so intuitively I want to say pornography shouldn't exist, and I'm not saying who should ban it in that sense, but perhaps certainly in China they do. Like, I was speaking to someone who knows a lot about China, and they've very strict restrictions on this stuff, especially for children, especially social media use and so on. Complicated who does that and why. You would hope that it could be done at the level of the family and the individual, but it's true that children don't know, or young people don't know what it is that they want or don't want, right? They don't, and they constantly want to test the limit because that's what they do. That's how you find out like where the limit is. Except if you live in a culture in which the limit is like, you know, miles away from what it used to be, you end up very quickly. And I think Billie Eilish said something very interesting. You know, she's a very famous pop star, and she said something like you did about pornography. She said, I wish I'd not been exposed to it at 12. You know, I think it ruined my sexuality and my life. Like, it took something from me. And I thought that was quite brave of her as someone in the public realm, even to make that critique, because, you know, we're supposed to be so sex positive and whatever, except we're not really. It's not actually really about sex. But
Right.
anyway, so I would ban pornography on aesthetic grounds, and on the grounds that it destroys people's imagination. I think we have the capacity to fantasize, and this is much better and much more, maybe more subtle, but sexuality should be subtle. It should be erotic. It should have mystery. You know, the kind of 4D hyper close up, nothing is secret thing is like frightening, and it's too much. It's like, I don't want to see every last, you know, micromillimeter of someone's genitals. Like, you know what, that's like, where's the mystery, man? Where's the like the mystique, you know? And I think the erotic needs that kind of, you know, suspension and mystique and distance. And I think it's like we live in the least erotic age, maybe the most sexual age, but the least erotic. You know, it's all been pummeled machine like.
Ooh, okay. Now that's a good segment. We could clip it and ship it. I just want to say, because I with our remaining we got about 15 minutes here. I wanted to ask you about this course that you are teaching on nature, but I just wanted to say, like, a quick throwaway comment is just that, yeah. So I mean, of course, there's a with political philosophy, there's deconstructing our political common sense, and then there's also like genuinely thinking, well, what would be a just and good society, and then there's this sort of tendency that I find annoying, at least when it's done in a sort of unself-aware way, which is where we start acting like we're a bunch of senators or Bolsheviks in 1918, but I said in an unself-aware way. In the very like aware way where it's playing, I will just say that if I get to choose who gets to choose the laws in the society, I would like to put together a Supreme Court with Nina and Louise Perry and a couple other ladies on it. I don't know. I want to have an all-women's Supreme Court, and then I want to have an all-men's Supreme Court, and then these two courts have to deal with different problems. But then there's going to be certain problems where they both have to come in and deal with it, and this has nothing to do with left or right, because it would completely reconfigure things. But that's just what I would do. But no one's asking me, so it doesn't really matter. But anyway, with that said, okay, nature. What are you doing with this course on nature? Can you tell us a little bit about the syllabus and how you thought about putting it together? Who are these thinkers that are you consider so important on the question and on the concept?
Okay, so I periodically teach adult education, which anyone can attend in London, just to be clear. So it's like a kind of afternoon in-person course in East London, and a lot of like retired people and unemployed people and just like random people. I have like a group of people who tend to come to my courses, and we're kind of friends. I run them more as like lecture seminar groups, as reading groups, and it's very, very fun and very interesting. There's no assessment. It's all just purely for enjoyment and interest and enthusiasm. And I think this is like one of the best ways of teaching and being together. So I'm very interested in things that get obscured and that people don't want to talk about, because I am autistically obsessed with pointing out things that people don't want to talk about and talking about them anyway, much to the annoyance of many people. And obviously I'm very cancelled and disliked by vast numbers of people, but I find this just funny and delightful, and a wonderful recognition, and that I serve some meaning and purpose in other people's lives as a object of hatred.
Sure.
Wonderful. So I think that nature is one of these topics which cause a great deal of consternation. We have a kind of socially, politically acceptable version of it, which is sort of to do with the environment and green politics, and this is really a kind of lefty liberal thing. We have activists along these lines. Two of which have recently just gone to prison, which I was very surprised about, for throwing soup on a Van Gogh painting for criminal damage. I was surprised because they're middle class and normally people like that don't go to prison. In this case, they decided to send them away. But in any case, but there is there's a kind of acceptable face of environmentalism, which is nominally about protecting the future and the environment and cutting back on fossil fuels and things like that, right? So we know, but often these people won't talk about nature. They don't have necessarily like a kind of vivid, wild love for the natural world. They sometimes have a kind of quasi-religious fear of apocalypse, which they tie to environmental destruction and a kind of climate change idea. And they're often quite puritanical in terms of their solution, which often involve like working class people having less holidays or whatever, and very asymmetrical idea of how we solve this problem. So there is that kind of liberal model, but it's not nature, and it's certainly not nature in the philosophical sense. So I wanted to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks and look at the pre-Socratics. Of course, we understand that we get the idea of physis, where we get the idea of physics. But prior to these kind of disciplinary divisions, as Heidegger and Husserl and others point out, we have a kind of recognition and an attempt to come to terms with what there is. And so you start to get these elemental theories, and we would describe these like proto-scientific. They're not myth, they might be mingled with myths still. They're poems, Parmenides poems, and so on. And we have the kind of atomists, we have the idea that there's atoms in the void and that there's a kind of contingency. And then on the other hand, you have Plato, who's saying it's not contingent, it's ordered. There is a kind of cosmogony, and it's based on this idea of psyche and the soul, and that matter is a kind of, inferior to the idea of soul and access to the forms. So you have this very, very visionary discussion about what nature is and what the beginning of the universe is and what the role of meaning is, which is tied very much to order and the god or gods, or whether there is meaninglessness and chaos and in matter, and consequently a kind of atheism. And Plato discusses this in book 10 of the Laws, and elsewhere. And it's a very exciting moment in the history of human thought, right, where this object, nature, starts to be discussed, and it's difficult for us to translate it. We understand like natura from the Romans, like we're going to read Lucretius's wonderful poem De Rerum Natura, which is his account of Epicurean thought. But really we have this idea of, prior to that, of looking at things and seeing some things grow, some things seem to be self-moving. There is this process, there is this generation, there is this thing that we observe, that we can almost enjoy, when we look at plants and birds and nature, and in that sense, as well as the kind of violence and fear and terror that is involved in like the sublime danger of nature, the fact that we're not in control of storms and hurricanes and tsunami, and that nature threatens to overwhelm us. And of course we might say, slightly reductively, that a lot of myth and the pantheistic gods are an attempt to personify and in a way deal with the threat of nature, that which can't be controlled, that which humanity doesn't have power over. We can personify the lightning bolt, we can give a name to the sea and tell a story. And and there's something very like marvelous about this moment. But I think the kind of philosophical questions then become partly about what the relationship between nature and thought is, and to go back to this question of the inhuman and the scientific, like to what degree can we control nature, or think about using our thought in order to construct ways of coping with it, both conceptually and technologically. We have moments like the German Romantics would be an obvious moment, trying to think about the way in which the limits of reason, if you like. There's also the question of nature in politics, so the question of natural law. Can we trace a political system from an idea of who we are, and whether there are indeed better and worse ways of organising and structuring society on the basis of an understanding of our own nature, or whether we just accept that all politics is man-made and that, you know, it is sort of is what it is. It grounds itself without appeal to anything more fundamental. And then I suppose we're going to look at some extreme theories as well, just out of speculative interest. We're going to look at Penty-Linkola and the idea of a kind of that humanity is the virus, if you like, and that you know, non-human nature it needs to be defended from us, and there should be kind of depopulation. You know, I think we're probably familiar with at least that idea in Nietzsche, and also obviously Ted Kaczynski and the kind of you know, the idea that technology is the kind of problem, we need to sort of destroy this technological society, as well as sort of slightly wacky theories like the aquatic ape theory, the idea that we all came from the sea, if you like, and that this is our origin. So there's going to be a kind of evolutionary part, as well as a kind of Aristotelian natural philosophy and, you know, natural law part, looking at Aquinas. I'm missing some people, some German romantics, so kind of romantic. I'm quite interested in romantic anti-capitalism at the moment, and you know what it means to Spinoza. Obviously, we're going to talk about Deus sive natura, God or nature, and the idea of substance as immanence, and the idea that we're part of nature, that we're a mode of nature, and how Spinoza is quite important for certain thinking in science, that contemporary scientific approach, like parallelism, like, yeah, I don't know, I'm missing various people, but yeah, I just want to bring back the concept, I suppose, and just to say, let's talk about nature, what it is. And it's very interesting. Some people in the class are very pro nature, pro the discussion. Some people want to say, no, we don't have access to like the cow, like there is no cow outside of our domestication of it, right? Like that we have manipulated and changed the world to such a degree that there is nothing we can refer to underneath, you know, which is a position, right? And we're having this great debate, and it's a proper philosophical discussion, which is absolutely amazing. And then if we talk about human nature, like this is very controversial. Like clearly it is, like whether we're talking about Aristotle's idea that there are really different types of human, and some people are born slaves, and that women have these capacities and they should behave in this sort of way. And I think the fear that people have of even bringing up the idea of nature is, if you start to define things in terms of their essence, then you're going to end up tracing an ought from an is. And if you say that something is this, you're saying that it must therefore behave like this or be like this, as opposed to thinking about it in terms of capacity or potentiality, which is a much more subtle way. And obviously saying something is capable of doing something doesn't mean that they have to do it, right? Like if we say that a fertile woman is capable of having children, we're not saying that therefore she must. She's saying we're saying it's a potentiality. And that's important, these distinctions. But I think not often there is just this kind of worry, like, no, we can't invoke nature at all, right? That this is a off-limit topic. And the moment you go down there, you start to make, you know, talk about differences between men and women, differences between different populations, and this is going to end in genocide or something. Or indeed, like your point at the beginning, like, oh, that we're going to end up romanticizing the violence of nature, and just and think that everything is hierarchical and fated, and that we simply must submit to you know, our fate rather than defend contemporary medicine, for example, right? But it's very obvious that something like contemporary medicine, for example, can go wildly out of control. Like technophilia is also a huge problem, right? and fetishizing the idea that we've got a technical solution, whether it be medical or otherwise, is also very dangerous. You know, there's clearly huge dangers in that too. So it's trying to establish, I suppose, this middle ground for a discussion in the first place, and then to get people to expound almost on their intuitions. You know, like, is there something that they would refer to as nature? What does it mean to them? You know, are we part of it? If we are or we aren't, should we be defending it? What is our role vis-a-vis nature? Is there anything left to defend? You know, that kind of thing.
Amazing. Yeah. So I guess we basically have to close out here. I want to give Nance a moment to say something, but I just wanted to, like, my little list of problems with nature and why people get so easily triggered on it. So
The system is so
wrong bite. Hold on.
trigger warning.
Eugenics, IQ,
Yeah.
Sex versus gender, violence, naturalizing it, sublimity, like the sublime. You know, people want to just act like they're, you know, oh, well, beauty could be whatever we want it to be. Look, you can be obese and hairy and never shower. And we can say it's beautiful as long as the legitimated or the institution legitimates it. And it's like, cool, you know, and obviously there's a lot of wiggle room there, right? Because nobody thinks that Barbie is natural or good or beautiful or sublime, except for like maybe a little kid, or someone with some nostalgia. But this basic litany of these things that people are scared of, like eugenics, IQ, sex, hierarchy, violence, sublimity. And of course with IQ, we're always getting at some race realism shit. And so it's like, yeah, these are all like, ooh, you can't talk about that. And it's, to me personally, I think very eye-opening that we can't talk about nature, that we're not supposed to talk about nature, that it's not on the table, to where if I have a friend, and I have many who have very strong positions on this, it's like they're convinced that you know, for instance, like you said, we can't get to the cow because it's, or we can't get to anything outside of what we have, and that we can't get to something real in the wild outside of ideology or language. At that point, I just want to say, okay, but your reaction and the way you take it so seriously is what it's like with the cheating, the husband who finds out his wife is cheating with Lacan, right? Like, when Lacan says, yeah, it's true, but the way that you're reacting shows us that there's something else going on here, right? Like there's something
But if you're paranoid about your wife cheating and she is cheating, you're still paranoid, right?
Right. And like the nerve, it's like, even if serious thinking about nature does lead to literally all of those things, the fact that we're not supposed to be able to talk about it is itself symptomatic, I feel like. And therefore, almost like it's like, to me, it just feels like, yeah, that's why we should go there. Like whenever we're being told we really can't go there, I'm like, well, then maybe it's time.
No, totally. And I think human beings are naturally curious about nature. And I mean, it's basically, the more you say to people, you can't look at population differences, or you can't say, you know, it's like people were going to do it. And I think it's better to do it in a sort of thoughtful and collective way, and not be like, you know, alienate people and make it taboo and therefore attractive. But I think the reality is that liberalism itself depends upon making these things both true and taboo. So that these are all things that everybody knows, but you're not allowed to really announce, because then the whole of the system would become apparent. And I think when you have the breakdown of various regimes, I think we're seeing that in some ways, it's like these things that are sort of known but taboo and hidden but there become obvious, right? And I think this is what's happening around sex, for example. This was pushed to a limit, and then people had to reassert something that everybody knew. It's like, well, okay, why are we doing this? But okay, because we've gotten to a point at which that thing, that this kind of shared truth, was eroded to such a degree that people wanted to do a raid on the nominalism, you know, like that we're going to change the meaning of words in law, you know, that the abstractions themselves, you know. And then it's like, okay, we have to maybe come back to this and say, well, what do we mean by these words, and reassert them or whatever. And so but I think, you know, it's anything to do with, because liberalism fantasy is that nature can be controlled and dominated and we can protect ourselves as much as possible from it. And that also is about us as well, like that we can control our own nature, as liberal individuals that are not first and foremost male and female or anything else. And that we can use medicine and hormones and whatever. And I think it's like, so it's the reassertion of that which our entire system depends upon occluding that I'm interested in, I guess.
All right. Thank you so much. We look forward to bringing you back. And
I'll see you again soon.
sorry you didn't
Bye,
get your
Nance.
chance. Sorry you didn't get a chance, Nance. Next time.
I always feel like it's like this. I think Nancy's always quietly waiting, and then David's like, "No, sorry, we're out of time now." Next time.
No.
It's all right, because I just have to
Let him-
write good papers. And then that's how we'll do it. Because there's never enough time when you're trying to talk to someone on the internet.
That's true. Well, it's an infinite conversation. All right, I'm going. Goodbye.
All right, take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
And we'll be right back, folks, right after this.
Revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place where you can support the free and public work at TU by becoming a patron over at Patreon. But if you would like to get involved and become a member at Theory Underground so that you can listen to special content that is not accessible to anyone else, or if you go up a subscriber level, actually join in the discussions, or at the top level, have us actually read your work, giving constructive feedback, and ultimately paving a way to potentially being a part of what we call the turn, then you'll want to become a subscriber. That's how you will access the ongoing courses and seminars. We've brought together Benjamin Studebaker's experience in political theory and science and philosophy with my critical social theory, phenomenology, existentialism, critique of political economy, critical media theory approach, combined with Michael Downes's fault line theory, the CCRU versus Ljubljana school, or Žižek versus Land. And of course, how he brings those against one another and then transcends them through other thinkers like Baudrillard, who he'll be teaching an intro course to in 2025. All of us are teaching stuff in 2025 that rhymes or argues or goes together. And so the best way to accelerate your development getting into theory right now is to just become a subscriber at TU. Just go to the website, click get involved, and what I'm about to play for you all is a really special moment from our documentary that we're working on, an interview where Benjamin explains why he's supporting Theory Underground and getting involved as a active member here at the core of the teaching team.
Yeah, so the thing that I notice is that a lot of people criticize the university, they criticize the left, they don't build an alternative institution. They will go, the university sucks, but you know what's great? Substack and Patreon and YouTube, and they'll lean into that. But that is a negation, right? You guys don't do that. You guys are interested in sublating the university within the newly emergent media. Or you could frame it the other way, sublating the newly emergent media within the university, right? And so this, of course, will ultimately lead, if you take it where it goes, to a question of institutions and having actual economic, social role possibilities for theorists. This is the critical crisis, which is that there are still some very bright, very well-educated people, but they are not able to replace themselves. And because most of them have university positions, their level of interest in replacing themselves is to some degree compromised.
Yeah.
They don't have to worry that much about themselves. They don't have that much stake in it because they're already set up. However, because you are in the underground, you have some potential of being able to actually create an institution or structure which makes it possible for people to do theory in the future. This is something that, as far as I can tell, only you are doing. The thing about freeing Mikey from wage labor, this idea not only that your channel would free you from the Amazon job, but that this could grow in such a way that it could provide spaces for multiple people, and then those multiple people could interact in the way that they would in a monastery or in a university department. This is the revolutionary idea in terms of raising consciousness and making it possible for us to think in such a way that we could return even to the horizons of the tens and talking about things like Medicare for all in a not stupid, not bullshit way, in a serious way. To get to that point, we need to raise our level of ability to think. We need new intellectuals in our generation that are real intellectuals and not people who are running around scared of what the DSA or their university department thinks of them. You have the potential to actually make a real material intervention into not just knowledge production, but in Bildung, into the making of people. Yeah. This is something that we can do. There's a window right now where I am not in the university, and so I have a real reason to think very seriously about, can we do something else? Because I'm annoyed, myself with the whole process of trying to be in that. And I would like there to be something else, something better. I have all my critiques of it that come in part from being at Cambridge, in part from studying ancient thinkers. We could do something better than it. Not just something that is an imitation or steals some things from it and does the best you can with it, but something that actually is better and that produces the kind of theory that in modernity, how do you make a Hegel? How do you make a Marx? We have to reinvent this. It's no longer possible to do that. We've got to, I think, actually institutionalize in a material way, and this is the sense in which I will uphold the kernel of materialism, actually giving a shit about the structure and what kind of structure is necessary to give rise to a form of life in which this kind of really, really good work can be produced.